The year was 1989. The high, jagged valleys of the northern mountain range were about to be swallowed by a white leviathan, an atmospheric monster the meteorologists would later classify as a once-in-a-century bomb cyclone. Outside, the world had been violently reduced to a screaming, horizontal blur of crushed ice and darkness. The wind was no longer just weather. It was a physical, malevolent entity, battering the landscape at 70 miles per hour, dragging the ambient temperature down to a lethal, bone-snapping 30 degrees below zero. In the opulent, sprawling estates that dotted the high ridge, homes built on the deeply arrogant assumption that money could simply purchase immunity from the raw wrath of nature, panic had already set in. Take the sprawling estate of Mr. Sterling. He was a man who measured his worth in thousands of acres and imported Italian marble, a man who looked down upon the valley as if he were a feudal lord. Just 3 months prior, he had boasted loudly at the town hall of his $15,000 state-of-the-art propane heating matrix. He had believed, with the blind faith of the modern elite, that copper pipes, massive fuel tanks, and digital thermostats were the ultimate triumph over the ancient, creeping cold. Now, the regional power grid had been dead for 48 hours. His massive, expensive backup generators had frozen solid, their diesel fuel turned to useless, cloudy gel in the merciless drop of the mercury. Inside his sprawling mansion, the towering cathedral ceilings, designed specifically to showcase his vast wealth, acted as massive thermal vacuums, sucking whatever meager warmth remained high into the useless, dark rafters. The silence of his dead, mechanical heaters was deafening. In the grand living room, under the mocking, useless glow of a crystal chandelier that would not light, Mr. Sterling was shivering violently in layers of imported, utterly inadequate cashmere. He was weeping in pure, unadulterated frustration. With bleeding, trembling hands, he was splintering a $4,000 hand-carved mahogany dining chair, feeding the polished, lacquered wood into a shallow, decorative fireplace that was never designed for actual survival. His breath hung in the freezing air like thick, gray smoke. His immaculate plumbing was bursting within the walls, the sound of snapping pipes echoing like gunshots. His wealth, his arrogance, and his modern technology had become his tomb. Less than 2 miles away, down in the shadowed hollow where the wind shrieked through the skeletal frozen branches of dead oaks, stood a structure the wealthy elites had long deemed a pathetic eyesore. It was a century-old wooden barn, its timber siding warped and grayed by time, daylight visibly piercing through the countless gaps in its rotting planks. It was a ruin, a ghost of an agricultural past. But deep inside the belly of this drafty, forgotten cavern, a completely different, almost miraculous reality existed. If you were to walk through the howling, blinding blizzard, push open those heavy, groaning barn doors, and step inside, the screaming wind would instantly lose its fangs. The barn blocked the horizontal violence of the storm, and there, standing dead center in the cavernous, shadowy dark of the barn floor, was the object of the valley's endless mockery, a tiny, 10 by 10 foot cube made of rusted, surplus corrugated steel. The elites of the town had called it a tin can. They had laughed until their sides ached at the sight of it. But inside this rusted cube, there was no shivering. There was no terror. 16-year-old Anya sat back in a worn wooden rocking chair, quietly reading a tattered paperback novel. She wasn't wearing a heavy winter coat, nor did she have thick gloves on her hands. She wore only a simple, faded cotton long-sleeve shirt. At her feet, her 8-year-old brother, Sam, lay comfortably on a woven rag rug, humming softly to himself as he drew a picture of a summer meadow with his crayons. The air around them was heavy, still, and profoundly warm. Hanging from a rusty iron nail on the inner steel wall, a simple mercury thermometer held remarkably, stubbornly steady at exactly 68 degrees. The source of this miraculous, life-saving heat was almost insulting in its absolute simplicity. A small handmade clay-lined stove, no larger than a standard water bucket, sat quietly in the corner. Inside it, a single, modest log of dry pine glowed with a fierce, quiet intensity. While Mr. Sterling burned his immense fortune just to delay frostbite, Anya was maintaining a perfect, stable, tropical sanctuary, using a system that had cost her exactly $43.50 at a local scrapyard. Her fuel consumption was exactly 1 log every 24 hours. It was a triumph not of money, but of invisible physics, not of arrogance, but of profound ancestral humility. To understand this impossible sanctuary, to comprehend exactly how a teenage girl with dirt under her fingernails outsmarted the wealthiest, most highly educated men in the county, we must look back. We must return to the fading warmth of autumn, to the days when the earth was still soft and yielding, and the cruelty of the world was measured in human sneers rather than dropping temperatures. 4 months earlier, Anya's entire world had collapsed into ash. Her grandfather, a man of quiet strength, profound wisdom, and heavily calloused hands, had passed away in his sleep, leaving her entirely orphaned at 16. She was suddenly the sole guardian of little Sam. The estate he left behind was practically non-existent. There were a few acres of rocky, unproductive land and the rotting carcass of the old barn. There was no life insurance. There were no hidden savings. There was just a mountain of overdue property taxes and the looming predatory shadow of the state's child protective services. The town's elites, particularly the gossiping, sharp-tongued Mrs. Harrington and the ever-calculating Sterling, watched her grief not with human pity, but with a cold, predatory hunger. They wanted her land. It perfectly bordered Sterling's vast manicured pastures, and he had long desired to bulldoze the old barn to expand his grazing routes for his prize-winning cattle. They whispered cruelly in the grocery store aisles. They pointed manicured fingers from the heated, leather-clad seats of their expensive imported trucks. "She's just a child," Mrs. Harrington would declare loudly, masking her greed with a sickly, sweet, fake concern. "She can't possibly survive the winter in that dilapidated, drafty shack. The boy will freeze to death. The authorities must step in and take him, for their own good." They delivered a ruthless ultimatum: sell the land for pennies on the dollar to Mr. Sterling, move herself into a cramped, sterile, state-run foster facility, and let little Sam be taken away to a proper, wealthy family, or try to face the brutal winter and let the freezing cold prove them all right. They fully expected her to break. They expected the crushing combined weight of poverty, grief, and the impending winter to force her into tearful submission. They firmly believed that human survival was a mere commodity, something that could only be purchased with a thick checkbook, a modern contractor, and expensive machinery. But Anya possessed something they fundamentally lacked. She held the memories of her grandfather's quiet voice in the dark. She carried the deep, silent wisdom of the forgotten generations who had tamed this harsh, unforgiving land long before propane delivery trucks and digital thermostats ever existed. She knew that nature does not care about bank accounts, zip codes, or social status. Nature only respects the unbreakable laws of thermodynamics. She knew she had to build a fortress, not with piles of cash, but with her own bleeding hands, discarded scraps, and the raw, undeniable laws of physics. She had to become the fierce protector she was destined to be. Her motivation was never pride. It was the soft, steady breathing of her little brother sleeping beside her, She would rather fight the very sky itself than let them take him away from her. Before we delve into the lost mechanics of thermal dynamics, before we reveal the brilliant, forgotten engineering that allowed a vulnerable, marginalized girl to utterly humiliate the arrogant modern world, I invite you to join our circle around the fire. If you believe that true wisdom is not bought, but inherited, and that humility will always outlast arrogance, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. Share this story with those who still appreciate the genius of the old ways. And tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you listening to this tale today? Are the old ways still remembered where you live? Now, let us return to the chilling, damp winds of late autumn, to the exact moment Anya looked at a pile of discarded, rusted metal and began to build her impossible refuge. The air of late October carried a bitter, metallic scent, the undeniable breath of a dying autumn yielding to an unforgiving winter. The morning frost had stopped being a delicate, glittering dew and had hardened into a sharp, crystalline crust that snapped beneath worn boots. For the wealthy of the valley, this changing of the guard was merely a signal to switch their thermostats from cooling to heating. A seamless, thoughtless transition fueled by endless credit lines and automatic bank transfers. But for 16-year-old Anya, every dropping degree was a ticking clock, a countdown to a frozen doom. She stood at the edge of the county scrapyard, her slender fingers gripped tightly around the splintering wooden handles of a rusted wheelbarrow. Beside her, little Sam kicked at a pebble, completely oblivious to the existential threat hovering over them. He trusted his sister with the pure, unblemished faith of a child. Anya had exactly $50.12 to her name, the absolute entirety of her liquid assets, carefully folded in the front pocket of her faded denim jeans. Towering before her was a mountain of discarded industrial decay, bent pipes, shattered engine blocks, and the refuse of a society that threw away anything that lacked an immediate, shiny polish. But Anya wasn't looking for polish. She was looking for geometry. She was looking for containment. Her eyes locked onto a stack of heavily oxidized, corrugated steel panels, surplus siding from an abandoned poultry facility. They were ugly. They were jagged. They were stained with streaks of orange rust that bled like old wounds down the rippled metal. But to Anya, peering through the lens of her late grandfather's quiet teachings, they were absolutely perfect. She approached the scrapyard owner, a gruff man who barely looked up from his ledger. The negotiation was brief, desperate, and heavily one-sided. She handed over 4 crumpled $10 bills, 3 singles, and 2 quarters. Exactly $43.50. It was the price of her brother's life. The physical toll of hauling the heavy, unwieldy steel panels the 3 miles back to the old, drafty barn was excruciating. The jagged edges of the metal bit through her thin canvas gloves, leaving angry red welts and shallow cuts across her palms. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned with the icy air. But the image of Sam shivering in the dark kept her legs moving. She was driven by an ancient, primal mandate, the absolute, non-negotiable duty to protect the innocent blood entrusted to her care. By the time she dragged the final panel into the cavernous, shadowy interior of the century-old wooden barn, the afternoon sun had surrendered to the encroaching twilight. The barn itself was a massive, skeletal beast. Its towering wooden walls were warped by decades of rain, leaving finger-wide gaps between the planks where the wind hissed and moaned. Standing inside it was barely warmer than standing outside. It was here, dead center on the packed dirt floor, that Anya began to bolt her salvaged panels together, erecting a tiny 10 by 10 foot cube, a steel box inside a wooden cathedral. It was the noise of the impact drill, a borrowed, battered tool echoing loudly through the empty valley that drew the vultures. A sleek, heavy-duty luxury truck, its paint gleaming like black glass, crunched arrogantly onto the gravel of Anya's property. The engine purred with the quiet confidence of an $80,000 price tag. The passenger window glided down with a soft, electric hum, releasing a billowing cloud of warm, climate-controlled air that smelled faintly of expensive leather and vanilla air freshener. Mr. Sterling leaned his heavy, flushed face out of the window. Beside him, in the passenger seat, sat Mrs. Harrington, clutching her designer handbag. Her eyes narrowed in a mixture of disgust and predatory excitement. "What in God's name is this monstrosity, girl?" Mr. Sterling's voice boomed, slicing through the quiet hum of the countryside. He stepped out of his heated sanctuary, his Italian leather boots sinking slightly into the soft, freezing mud. He walked into the drafty barn, looking around the towering wooden structure before his eyes fell upon the rusted steel cube Anya was assembling. He threw his head back and let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed cruelly against the rafters. "A tin can! You're building a literal tin can in the middle of a dilapidated barn." Anya did not stop working. She wiped a streak of grease from her forehead with the back of her bleeding hand, her eyes focused on aligning a heavy steel bolt. Mrs. Harrington stepped daintily into the barn, pulling her thick, fur-lined collar tight against her neck. "It's worse than an eyesore, Richard," she sneered, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "It's sheer madness. Look at that poor boy." She pointed a manicured finger at Sam, who was sitting quietly on a milk crate, wrapping his small hands around a mug of lukewarm water. "She's going to kill him. This is child endangerment, plain and simple." Mr. Sterling stepped closer, his shadow falling over Anya's small, kneeling frame. He crossed his arms, adopting the posture of a wealthy, educated man about to deliver a lecture to a filthy peasant. "Let me explain something to you, since your grandfather clearly failed to teach you basic science," he mocked, his tone heavy with arrogant condescension. "Do you know what thermal conductivity is? Steel is a conductor, you ignorant child. It doesn't trap heat. It absorbs it and bleeds it rapidly into the surrounding air." He kicked one of the corrugated panels with the toe of his expensive boot. The metal rattled thinly. "I just spent $15,000 on a pressurized propane matrix with intelligent zoning. My monthly heating bill will be $300 just to keep my home at a livable temperature. And you think $43 of rusted garbage is going to save you? You haven't built a shelter, girl. You've built a refrigerator. When the mercury drops to zero, that metal will turn into an icebox. You and that boy will freeze solid in that tin can." His mockery was technically precise, a reflection of modern textbook education. Metal is cold. Metal conducts cold. Therefore, a metal box in winter is a death trap. He placed the viewer's exact doubts right there in the icy air. How could a thin sheet of rusted steel possibly fight the catastrophic freeze of a mountain winter? How could a girl with dirty hands and zero budget defy the multi-$1,000 heating industry? "You are stubborn, arrogant, and foolish," Mrs. Harrington added, her voice sharp as glass. "I am calling the state authorities on Monday. For the boy's sake. They will take him to a warm facility, and we will finally tear this rotting hazard down." Anya slowly lowered her wrench. She did not yell. She did not cry. She looked at the towering, wealthy man in his pristine coat, and then at the frail, shivering frame of her little brother. The contrast between the arrogant elites, sustained by complex, fragile systems of money, and the solitary girl, armed only with the silent wisdom of the earth, was absolute. "You know the price of everything, Mr. Sterling," Anya said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the moaning wind pushing through the barn's wooden slats. "But you understand how nothing actually works." Sterling scoffed, his face turning a deep, angry red at her quiet defiance. "Enjoy your walk-in freezer, little girl," he spat, turning on his heel. "We'll see who is laughing when the blizzard hits." They marched back to their heated, leather-lined truck, the heavy doors slamming shut with the solid thud of modern engineering. The truck roared to life and sped away, leaving Anya alone in the darkening barn, surrounded by the bitter cold, the mocking echoes of their laughter, and the jagged, rusted walls of her tiny, impossible fortress. She picked up the wrench. She had a long night ahead of her. Mr. Sterling knew the physics of metal, yes, but he had fundamentally forgotten the physics of the wind, the profound magic of still air, and the unstoppable, silent power of the earth beneath their feet. As the taillights of Mr. Sterling's luxury truck faded into the freezing velvet blackness of the valley, silence reclaimed the old barn. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the skeletal rattling of the wooden siding and the soft, rhythmic breathing of little Sam, who had fallen asleep wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Anya stood alone in the dim light of a single kerosene lantern. Her hands were bruised, her fingers numb, and her lungs ached from the bitter air. The rusted steel cube sat before her, an ugly, jagged monument to her poverty. To the modern, educated eye of the wealthy elites, it was exactly what they had called it: a refrigerator, a death trap of conductive metal. But as Anya pressed her bleeding palm against the cold, rippled steel, she did not hear the mocking laughter of the town. She heard the deep, resonant voice of her grandfather. "Cold is not a beast that hunts you, little bird," he had told her years ago, his calloused hands packing damp earth around the roots of a sapling. "Cold is just the absence of heat. It is an empty room. You cannot fight an empty room with force. You must outsmart the thief that empties it. And out here, the greatest thief of all is the wind." Her grandfather, a man who possessed no formal degrees but understood the language of the earth better than any university professor, had taught her the ancient survival architecture of the forgotten world. He had taught her how the Inuit survived in domes of solid ice. He had taught her how prairie animals burrowed into the freezing dirt to find life-saving warmth. The secret was never about generating massive, expensive amounts of heat. The secret was containment. The secret was stillness. It was time to execute a masterclass in low-tech engineering, a principle of physics so profoundly simple and free that the modern heating industry had spent billions of dollars making humanity forget it. It was the principle of the double shell and the miraculous insulating power of dead air. Mr. Sterling was entirely correct about one scientific fact. Steel is a rapid conductor of thermal energy. If Anya had built her 10-by-10 metal hut out in the open field, the winter winds would have continuously stripped the heat from the outer surface of the metal, a process known as convective cooling. The wind would act like a massive, invisible sponge, sucking the warmth through the steel and instantly dissipating it into the atmosphere. Inside, it would indeed become a freezing coffin. But Anya had not built her hut in the open field. She had built it dead center inside the colossal, drafty wooden barn. The century-old barn was the outer shell. Yes, it was full of gaps and rotting planks. Yes, the temperature inside the barn was almost as cold as the air outside. But those warped wooden walls did something magnificent. They completely shattered the velocity of the wind. A lethal 70-mile-per-hour gale screaming across the valley was violently broken by the barn's exterior. By the time that air pushed through the cracks, it was reduced to a gentle 0-mile-per-hour draft. This created a 15-foot buffer zone between the inner walls of the wooden barn and the outer walls of Anya's rusted steel cube, a 15-foot ocean of trapped, stationary air. In the laws of thermodynamics, still air is one of the most powerful natural insulators on planet Earth. Because the air surrounding the steel hut was no longer moving, convective cooling dropped to absolute zero. The thief had been locked out. Now, when Anya introduced a heat source inside the steel cube, the metal would absorb the warmth, but with no wind on the outside to steal it away, the steel would act as a radiant mirror, gently bouncing the thermal energy back into the small, enclosed space, creating a perfect, unbreakable thermal bubble. But a fortress is nothing without a heart, and for that, Anya turned to the mud beneath her feet. While the men in the estates above paid exorbitant fees for massive iron boilers and complex digital sensors, Anya knelt in the dirt. With $0 in her budget, she began to construct a survival mechanism that had kept human beings alive for thousands of years, a high-efficiency thermal mass rocket stove. She gathered smooth, dense river stones, a pile of discarded red bricks from a ruined chimney, and buckets of thick, sticky red clay from the creek bank. Working methodically through the night, she built a small, J-shaped combustion chamber in the corner of her steel room. Unlike a traditional fireplace, which wastes 90% of its heat by sending it straight up a chimney, her design was a marvel of primitive fluid dynamics. She insulated the tiny firebox with a thick, heavy layer of wet clay mixed with dry grass. This heavy insulation ensured that the core temperature of the fire would reach a staggering 1800 degrees. At this extreme temperature, the wood did not just burn. The smoke itself ignited, resulting in pure, near-perfect combustion. There was no soot, no creosote, no wasted energy. The true genius, however, lay in the exhaust. Instead of venting the hot exhaust gases straight outside, Anya routed the rusted metal stovepipe horizontally, burying it inside a long, heavy bench made of compacted earth, stones, and clay. This was her thermal battery. When she struck a single match and lit a handful of dry twigs, feeding just one modest split pine log into the narrow feed tube, the stove roared to life with the sound of a jet engine. The intense heat rushed through the buried pipe. The massive weight of the clay and stone bench absorbed that thermal energy like a sponge soaking up water. Within 2 hours, the single pine log had burned down to fine white ash. The fire was out, but the massive earthen bench was now radiating a deep, penetrating, continuous heat that would last for the next 24 hours. Slowly, miraculously, the temperature inside the rusted steel cube began to rise, from a bone-chilling 35 degrees to 50 degrees, to a perfect, stable 68 degrees. The heavy, warm air filled the small space, wrapping around little Sam like a physical embrace. The steel walls, completely protected from the wind by the old wooden barn, hummed with a gentle, trapped warmth. The cost of this perfect thermodynamic sanctuary? Exactly $43 for the scrap metal, a few buckets of free dirt, and 1 log of fallen timber a day. Meanwhile, high up on the illuminated ridge, the valley's elite were drowning in their own hubris. Inside the opulent, sprawling country club, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and imported whiskey. Mr. Sterling sat in a plush leather armchair, holding court among the valley's wealthiest ranchers and businessmen. "I drove past the old property today," Sterling chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "The girl is actually living inside a pile of rusted chicken coop siding. She thinks a metal box inside a ruined barn is going to save her." A chorus of deep, wealthy laughter erupted around the mahogany table. "It defies all logic," scoffed the town's lead architectural contractor, a man whose entire livelihood depended on selling complex, expensive HVAC systems. Steel has a thermal conductivity rate hundreds of times higher than wood. The moment the ambient temperature drops, that metal will actively pull the heat out of their bodies. It's a tomb, a literal frozen tomb. I give it 3 days once the first real snow hits, Mrs. Harrington added from the adjacent table, sipping her wine. I have the Child Protective Services forms already filled out on my desk. It's a tragedy, really. But what can you expect from people who refuse to modernize? They simply don't have the funds or the intellect to survive in today's world. They toasted to their own perceived superiority. They toasted to the massive, humming propane tanks buried in their manicured yards, completely ignorant of the fact that their survival was tethered to a fragile, invisible grid of electricity, supply chains, and delicate microchips. They trusted the complex and mocked the simple. They believed that because they had spent thousands, they were invincible. They did not know that 3,000 miles to the north, a massive, swirling vortex of low pressure was gathering strength over the Arctic Circle. The atmosphere was collapsing, pulling down a polar vortex of unprecedented, historic violence. The 45-year record blizzard, the bomb cyclone, was no longer a forecast. It was a certainty, and it was heading straight for their fragile, glass-walled mansions. The pendulum of fate was about to swing. The ultimate test of the natural world was descending, and the very sky was about to judge the valley. It would not judge them by the balance in their bank accounts, but by the physical laws of the universe. The winter was coming to silence the arrogant and to validate the humble. On the afternoon of November 14, 1989, the sky over the northern ridge turned the sickly, bruised color of crushed slate. The barometric pressure plummeted so violently that the old-timers in the valley felt it aching in their joints. Then, the white Leviathan struck. The meteorologists called it a bomb cyclone, a terrifying atmospheric collapse that dragged a colossal vortex of Arctic air directly over the mountains. The wind hit the valley floor at a sustained 70 miles per hour, carrying a blinding horizontal sheet of pulverized ice. In less than 3 hours, the ambient temperature was violently dragged from a manageable 20 degrees down to a lethal, bone-snapping 30 degrees below zero. Up on the wealthy ridge, the illusion of modern supremacy shattered almost instantly. At 4:15 p.m., the primary power grid, heavy with inches of solid ice, snapped like rotten thread. The valley was plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. Inside Mr. Sterling's colossal, 10,000-square-foot mansion, the sudden silence was deafening. The gentle, mechanical hum of his $15,000 imported propane heating matrix died completely. Sterling, dressed in a silk smoking jacket, marched to the digital thermostat on his hallway wall and tapped the glass angrily. Nothing happened. The irony of modern engineering is its profound fragility. Sterling had 2,000 gallons of highly combustible propane sitting in a massive steel tank buried in his yard, but the microscopic, delicate electronic valves and digital motherboards required to ignite it were entirely dependent on the fragile electric grid. Without a spark of electricity, his $15,000 investment was absolutely useless. Ridiculous, he muttered, his breath already beginning to form a faint white mist in the dimming light of the hallway. He grabbed a flashlight and marched out to his heated 3-car garage to manually engage his $10,000 industrial backup generator. He hit the heavy green ignition button. The machine whined, coughed a sluggish puff of black smoke, and died. He hit it again. Silence. Mr. Sterling, a man with a master's degree in business, did not understand the brutal chemistry of the natural world. He had filled the generator with standard summer blend diesel. At 30 degrees below zero, untreated diesel fuel suffers from a fatal flaw. The paraffin wax inside it crystallizes. The fuel had literally gelled into a thick, cloudy paste, hopelessly clogging the fuel lines and filters. His high-tech, expensive savior was now nothing more than a heavy block of freezing iron. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced his arrogance. His mansion, designed by elite architects to showcase his immense wealth, featured towering cathedral ceilings and massive, floor-to-ceiling double-pane windows that offered sweeping views of the valley. But the laws of thermodynamics are blind to aesthetics. Without an active furnace pumping massive volumes of forced hot air, those soaring 30-foot ceilings acted as a colossal heat sink, sucking whatever residual warmth remained high up into the useless rafters. The massive glass windows, despite their expensive double glazing, began to violently radiate the sub-zero cold inward. The ambient temperature inside the living room plummeted with terrifying speed, from 72 degrees to 50 degrees, then to 35 degrees, plunging past the freezing mark as the night deepened. 2 miles away, down in the forgotten, shadowed hollow of the valley, the storm unleashed its absolute fury upon the century-old wooden barn. The 70-mile-per-hour winds slammed into the warped, rotting exterior planks with the acoustic violence of a runaway freight train. The ancient timbers groaned, shrieked, and rattled under the immense kinetic pressure. The snow blasted through the finger-wide gaps in the siding, forming long, sweeping white drifts across the dirt floor. But deeply buried within the belly of that roaring wooden beast, the pendulum of reality swung to a place of absolute, profound peace. Inside the 10-by-10 rusted steel cube, 16-year-old Anya did not hear a freight train. She heard only a muffled, distant whisper. The massive wooden barn was taking the absolute beating of the wind, shattering the 70-mile-per-hour gale into a harmless 0-mile-per-hour draft by the time it crossed the 15-foot buffer zone. The dead air gap was holding. Inside the tin can, the temperature was a perfectly stable, unyielding 68 degrees. Anya struck a single match. She dropped it into the small, clay-lined combustion chamber of her rocket stove, feeding it one single, dried piece of scavenged pine wood. The fire roared quietly, a contained, hyper-efficient burn at 1800 degrees. The heavy earthen bench absorbed the thermal energy, acting as a massive, silent battery. Because there was absolutely zero wind touching the outside of her rusted steel walls, the metal did exactly what Mr. Sterling said it would. But in reverse, it did not bleed heat into the storm. It acted as a thermal mirror, radiating the gentle warmth back into the tiny room. Sam was fast asleep on the rug, his chest rising and falling softly, his small face flushed with warmth. Anya sat in her rocking chair, the soft, golden light of a kerosene lantern illuminating the pages of her book. The cost of her survival was $0. Her power grid was the earth. Her fuel was a broken branch. While the world outside tore itself apart, her sanctuary was an unbreakable fortress of ancient physics. Meanwhile, the psychological and technical collapse of the valley's elite was absolute. By midnight, the temperature inside Mr. Sterling's mansion had reached a lethal 10 degrees. He was a man who had spent his entire life commanding men, manipulating markets, and believing that his checkbook was a shield against mortality. Now, wrapped in 3 layers of $2,000 imported cashmere, he was shivering so violently he could barely stand. The physical pain of the cold was excruciating. His fingers and toes burned as frost nips set in. "How is this happening?" he screamed into the echoing, dark void of his grand living room, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "I paid for the best. Where are the plows? Where is the electric company? He was asking questions to a sky that did not care. He had mocked the simple, and now the complex was actively killing him. In a fit of desperate, primal terror, Sterling dragged one of his heavy, $4,000 hand-carved mahogany dining chairs into the center of the living room. He threw it against the marble floor, shattering the legs. With trembling, bleeding hands, he shoved the splintered lacquered wood into the shallow, decorative gas fireplace, a fireplace never designed to draft real wood smoke. He lit it with a trembling lighter. The toxic, chemical-soaked lacquer ignited, instantly filling the grand room with thick, blinding, choking black smoke. Coughing violently, weeping from the stinging soot and the agonizing cold, the wealthiest man in the county curled into a pathetic ball on his imported Persian rug, fighting just to see the morning. A mile down the ridge, Mrs. Harrington was faring no better. Her modern smart home was entirely paralyzed. Her electric driveway gates were frozen shut, trapping her luxury SUV inside. Her phone lines were dead. The cold had penetrated her walls so deeply that she could hear the catastrophic, echoing crack of her expensive copper plumbing bursting inside the drywall, the frozen water shredding the pipes like paper. She sat in her dark, freezing kitchen, wrapped in a down comforter, staring at the useless digital display of her luxury oven, realizing with absolute, horrifying clarity that her social status meant absolutely nothing to the ice forming on her countertops. The storm raged on. The bomb cyclone was not just a weather event. It was a brutal, uncompromising judge. It stripped away the fragile, expensive illusions of the modern elite, leaving them naked before the raw power of the earth. They had laughed at the tin can. They had mocked the dirt, the rusted metal, and the humble girl who dared to use them. But as the longest, deadliest night of the century dragged on, the only warm heartbeat in the entire valley belonged to the marginalized orphan and the brother she swore to protect. The morning of the third day broke with a blinding, terrifying clarity. The shrieking winds of the bomb cyclone had finally exhausted themselves, leaving behind a silence so absolute, so heavy, it felt as though the entire world had been buried alive. The sun rose over the jagged peaks, casting long, pale blue shadows across a valley that had been violently transformed into an alien, frozen wasteland. The temperature hovered at a deadly minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. High up on the ridge, the monuments of modern arrogance had been reduced to literal iceboxes. Mr. Sterling's 10,000-square-foot mansion was a spectacular failure of engineering. Without the massive, artificial heartbeat of his grid-dependent propane matrix, the towering structure had completely surrendered to the elements. Frost, half an inch thick, coated the inside of his floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. The imported marble floors were slick with frozen condensation. Sterling himself was barely recognizable as the commanding, wealthy cattle baron of the valley. He was crawling on his hands and knees across his living room, draped in layers of stiff, freezing blankets, his face smeared with the toxic, greasy black soot from the mahogany chair he had tried to burn the night before. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his fingers a sickly, pale blue. Beside him, clutching a useless, dead cell phone, was Mrs. Harrington. She had abandoned her own frozen smart home hours ago, wading through waist-deep snow in a desperate, primal panic to reach Sterling's estate, only to find that his wealth had failed exactly as hers had. "Richard," she gasped, her voice barely a dry rasp in the freezing air. "We are going to die here. We are actually going to freeze to death." Sterling did not answer. He slowly pulled himself up to the frosted window, wiping a small circle clear with his numb, bleeding knuckles. He looked down into the shadowed hollow of the valley. Through the pristine, blinding white of the snow, he saw it. The old wooden barn. It was still standing. And rising from a small, rusted metal pipe protruding from the barn's rotting wall was a thin, steady, almost invisible shimmer of heat distortion. It wasn't the thick, black smoke of a desperate, inefficient fire. It was the clear, clean exhaust of a perfect, high-temperature combustion. It was life. Driven by the ultimate, degrading equalizer of biological survival, the two wealthiest elites in the county stumbled out of their frozen palace. They did not take their checkbooks. They did not take their expensive jewelry. Because in the face of 30 degrees below zero, $1 million in a bank account is absolutely mathematically useless. They waded through 4 feet of snow, falling, crawling, weeping, reduced to the very same pathetic, vulnerable state they had so cruelly mocked in others. It took them 2 hours to cross the 2 miles. By the time they reached the heavy, snow-banked doors of the century-old wooden barn, they were slipping into the fatal, lethargic grip of severe hypothermia. Sterling pushed the heavy barn door open with the last fraction of his strength. They collapsed onto the packed dirt floor inside. Instantly, the brutal biting sting of the outside air vanished. The barn's drafty wooden walls had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They had killed the wind. Through his half-closed, frozen eyelids, Sterling looked toward the center of the cavernous space. There stood the rusted, ugly, corrugated steel cube. The tin can he had laughed at. The refrigerator he had sworn would become a tomb. He dragged his heavy, agonizing body across the dirt. He reached out a trembling, frost-bitten hand and pressed his bare palm flat against the rusted steel siding. It was warm. Not just tepid. It was radiating a deep, solid, magnificent heat. The metal was acting as a perfect thermal mirror, holding the invisible energy of the dead air gap. Sterling broke down. The man who had sneered at the physics of the earth now collapsed against the rusted metal, weeping uncontrollably. He balled his fist and banged weakly on the steel. "Anya!" he sobbed, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former booming arrogance. "Anya, please! I'm sorry. I was wrong. I'll give you $10,000. I'll give you the deed to my lower pastures. Just let us in. Please, God, let us in. We are dying." For a long, agonizing minute, there was only the sound of Sterling's pathetic sobbing. Then, the heavy latch of the steel door slid back with a sharp clack. The door creaked open. A physical wave of heavy, 80-degree air rolled out of the hut, hitting Sterling and Mrs. Harrington like the embrace of a divine being. It smelled of dry pine, warm clay, and absolute safety. Anya stood in the doorway. She was barefoot. She wore the same faded cotton shirt. Behind her, the internal thermometer hung stubbornly on the wall, resting perfectly at 68 degrees. On the massive earthen bench, little Sam was sitting cross-legged, happily eating a bowl of warm oatmeal, entirely untouched by the apocalyptic trauma that had just ravaged the valley. Anya looked down at the 2 shivering, soot-stained elites at her feet. She held all the power in the universe. She could have demanded their fortunes. She could have slammed the door and let the brutal, undeniable laws of physics enact a final, fatal vengeance upon the people who had tried to steal her brother and her land. They had earned their frozen doom through their own profound hubris. But the wisdom of the earth does not teach cruelty. It teaches balance. It teaches the sublime, unbreakable strength of humility. "Keep your money, Mr. Sterling," Anya said softly, her voice carrying the ancient, solemn weight of her grandfather's memory. "Paper doesn't hold thermal mass, and pride burns out too fast." She stepped aside, opening the door wide. "Leave your frozen boots outside. The mud will ruin the heat." Come in." Sterling and Mrs. Harrington crawled across the threshold, collapsing onto the warm woven rug. As the steel door clicked shut behind them, sealing the thermal bubble once more, they felt the deep, penetrating heat of the earthen rocket stove bench wrapping around their freezing bones. The air was perfectly still. The single pine log glowing inside the tiny, clay-lined combustion chamber was quietly doing what $15,000 of modern machinery could not. Sterling lay on the floor, staring up at the rusted, unpainted corrugated steel ceiling. He looked at the tiny pile of broken branches in the corner. He looked at the 16-year-old girl who had defeated the mountain, the grid, and the arrogance of modern man with nothing but dirt, scrap metal, and ancestral physics. In that profound, silent warmth, Mr. Sterling's ego did not just break, it completely disintegrated. He wept silently, mourning the arrogant fool he had been, and silently blessing the humble hands that had just saved his life. The pendulum of justice had swung, and it had settled on absolute truth. The elites had trusted the fragile illusions of money and complex systems. The orphan girl had trusted the immovable laws of thermodynamics, the insulating power of dead air, and the deep, eternal heartbeat of the earth. And the earth had protected her own. We have become a society that worships the complex and despises the simple. We build glass mansions in the path of the storm, wire our survival to fragile, invisible grids, and mock the old ways as the relics of the poor and the uneducated. But when the sky darkens, when the digital screens go black and the mechanical hearts of our modern world freeze solid, nature will not ask to see your bank account. Nature will only ask if you remember how to listen to the silent logic of the physical world. Anya's tin can was not a miracle. It was a masterpiece of forgotten science. It was the triumph of thermal mass, the absolute genius of the double-envelope dead air gap, and the undeniable proof that true wealth is not the money you hoard, but the knowledge you inherit. Her grandfather's legacy did not just keep a little boy warm at 68 degrees. It humbled the kings of the valley and brought them to their knees before the altar of humility. If this story resonated with the ancient, quiet wisdom that still beats within your own chest, I ask you to stand with us. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to honor the legacy of the old ways, and share this audio documentary with those who still understand the value of a single, well-placed log. We are a global tribe, bound not by borders, but by the shared understanding that the Earth's wisdom will always outlast human arrogance. Tell me in the comments below, from which city and country are you listening today? And in your part of the world, are the old lessons of survival still passed down, or have they been buried under the concrete of the modern age? Thank you for walking this frozen valley with us. Until next time, keep your fires small, your walls sealed, and your hearts humble.